Today's session, and our insight session today, is to cover calculations in Stratum, and I wanted to talk about those at a couple different levels and talk about calculations, just start with talking about calculations in general. And as many of you probably know, calculations in Stratum, they can be pretty easily done and they can get very, very complex, and they use a underlying language that's called MDX, which has to do with multi-dimensional calculations that reference information that's stored as it is in Stratum in a cube-style database or an OLAP-style database. So all of that may or may not be interesting to folks, but what's important is that those things, that we make those things easy for you to use. And there's a couple of things that we've done, and there's a number of resources out there to try and make this, to give you easy access to a bunch of resources beyond a session like this. And a couple of those things, I just thought I'd talk about them real quick. The obvious ones might be, there's a video creating calculated columns right down here, so hopefully everyone can see that. That's right off the home page. That video is about 5.5 to 6 minutes long, but it certainly has a bunch of stuff in there. There are a number of other things in the Stratum world that fall into what I'll call calculations. I think when we all talk about calculations, we think of numbers, margin percentage or something like that. But calculations in Stratum can also be used for filtering. They can be used for a lot of different things. We're going to focus mostly on numeric calculations today, but I'll show some other stuff as well. But that's one of the resources here, right here off the Watch Our Videos. The other is obviously you can go back in the archived courses here. There's been other Insight courses about calculations, so you can look those up. There's a bunch of stuff there. And then the last is the help. If I was to go into, say just any view and run a view, you'll see that there's context-sensitive help. If I go up and add a measure to a view, if I go ahead and just add another measure in here, if I insert a calculated measure, you'll see right down here there's a help button. And Stratum help in general and over the last couple of releases has gotten more and more context sensitive, so that as you click on help from certain locations, you'll be taken straight into the help specifically for that. And there's some great examples. Our documentation folks have done a great job of adding context-sensitive and specific examples, I think, that matter. And then not only that, you can cut and paste from here. So, you can highlight this stuff and take stuff out of there. So a lot of good examples that you can reach from in the help. The other thing in the help, if you search on just the, as I mentioned, MDX, you'll see over here on the right, you'll get a list of a number of different things where we have MDX expressions that you can go and steal from. So the create and calculated measure one's quite good, and this dynamic user list one is also quite good as a source for things. So that's just a little bit on resources that are available for you to go ahead and grab information and learn more about measures. So as a point of logistics for this particular meeting, as usual, right now the phone's on mute. I'm going to unmute the phone at the end, assuming we have a little bit of time. I also have the chat window up. As Ann was able to discern, I often respond to everybody instead of, I'll try and respond privately if the message is a private message. But anyways, I'm trying to monitor that window as well. So those are all things that you can take a look at, or in a way to communicate with me. So I'm going to start with just talking about some pretty basic calculations in Stratum. And I'm going to use, throughout this, I'm going to use what I think is a real simple view in Stratum. I'm going to use this comparative view right here. And this obviously, maybe not obviously, but this is a rolling 3 months. This is the previous month. So in my demo, as many of you have heard me say before, it's always September. So I'm looking at the previous month, the last closed month, year over year, and then I'm looking at year to date here. Year over year, and I've got a calculation in here. But let's just talk about some real basic calculations here. Let's say, for example, I wanted to see the margin amount. So the first thing for the current year, and I'll say that for year to date. So the first thing I'd need to do is get the margin in here. And by the way, another thing I'm going to talk about today, or I'm going to show some today, in some of my examples at some point here, I'm going to go into the upcoming version 6.9. We've done some things for adding calculations to make it much simpler for you to add calculations. We've moved that up to the top bar, added some things to make just the process of adding a calculation easier. For the majority of the presentation, though, I'm going to be in version 6.8, which is our current GA version. If you're on any version prior to this, you really shouldn't have any issues with what I'm doing. You can always, as everyone knows, you can work in the View Explorer or you can work in the grid. But most of the things I'm going to show are pretty straightforward with regards to any 6.x version you're on. You can use the technique that I show or something very, very similar to that. When I get to the 6.9 stuff, I am going to show some things that are only available in 6.9 with regards to how you build the calculation, but not in terms of things you can do in a calculation. So with that said, back to my story. Couple of things here. To get to gross margin amount, one of the first things, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to insert a regular measure here. So I have the costs. In my example, I have a standard cost out there, and I'm just going to go down and I'm going to add the extended, not the handling cost. I'm actually going to add the extended standard cost to this. And I'm going to do that just to keep my calendars in sync. I'm going to do this identically to how the other measures are there. So this is January through for the current year up through the previous month. So I'm just going to go ahead and add that measure in there, right? So now I've got these two measures. You can see that define both the sales for year-to-date as well as my cost year-to-date. And let's do a real simple calc. And the reason I want to show this is there's a couple of options here on these more simple calcs. So I'm going to go ahead here and insert to get to the gross margin amount. That's really just sales minus the standard cost. Pretty simple stuff in Stratum to go ahead and do that. I can go ahead and insert a calculated measure. And here I'm just going to pick my measure items. I'm going to say, what was it? It was actual sales this year. So I just clicked on that, put a minus sign in there, and then I put the standard cost here. And amazingly enough, that will insert a number there. So that number is not going to look very good. It isn't cleaned up. So we can do a number of things here. You can open the View Explorer and get to it, or I can just go down here to Properties. It's going to pop this up, and I can do a couple of things here. I can go ahead and I'm going to give this a title. So this is what the margin. I'm going to actually call this the View margin amount, just to delineate it. Another thing that you can do on these things that's new in some of the newer versions, you can actually add information from the measures that are in the calculation. In this case, maybe I want to add, from here, so I'm adding the time here so I know what time this margin covers. So I can say from and the 2-period short description, and I'll throw the year in here as well. I'll put a year in here. So I can evaluate that, take a look at it. That's what my heading's going to look like. So I'll go ahead and I've added that measure. So that measure I added in the view. I forgot to add a format string, so I'll come right here and I'll just drop this down, and that was a dollar figure. So I'll go ahead and give it a basic rounded up dollar number there. So I've gone ahead and I've added a calculation that is basically a simple subtraction. And if it was simple subtraction, addition, division, or multiplication, you can do it that way. On division, I think that's where you would probably want to use probably one of what we call our Stratum functions, which allows you to protect yourself from a divide by zero, and I'll show that in a minute. But that said, what I wanted to show here with that margin amount, when you have a simple calculation like that that just uses basic numeric operators, again, plus, minus, divide, multiply, you can predefine those so that a user wouldn't even need to do that math. If the margin amount, which I think is a good example, was something that you used often, you could actually create a calculation in the setup of Stratum to do that, to just reference that. And what you'll see here is if I go here and I do a insert of a regular measure, I'm going to again search for sales, but what you'll see, if I scroll down in my window here, you'll see there's a block of measures that come from what we call category that are calculated measures. And in fact, one of those is the gross margin amount at standard. So there's the actual sales gross margin standard amount. So again, if I just flip this to be the same calendar as I was looking at, current year, we were doing year to date, current year, we're doing it through the previous month. and just say okay. That'll bring that in. It's already formatted. And where do we go here? Yeah, here we go. That was a standard cost. I didn't bring in the margin amount. I brought in the wrong thing. So that's okay. If we go over here and we open up the View Explorer, I'll come in here and there's that. Here's the measure I just added, gross margin amount standard. Where do I got that? Actual sales cost. There's my view gross margin. Yeah, there we go. I did add the right thing. I'm sorry. And there you can see those two columns have the same number in them. So my point being there, you wouldn't have to go ahead and predefine that measure. And just for those of you that are actual I don't know if anyone on the phone actually sets up Stratum, but in the configuration side back here, I went into category maintenance, and you can see here, if I highlight these actual sales calculated measures, if I go to the gross margin amount, I can define these things, gross margin amount standard, and look at what the expression is, and amazingly enough, it's sales minus the cost. So in this definitional piece here, in this setup piece, you can define very simple calculations and make those available to the user community so they never have to do that calculation again. So that's a pretty basic thing there. I think a couple of things I wanted to show in my view here, in my view calculated measure. When you're adding calculations to a view, a couple of things. You can add comments by putting a / in front of them and say that, this is sales minus the standard cost or something like that, just to remind you what you've done there. And as your calculations get more complex, inserting these comments as you do different sections of your calculation becomes more and more pertinent, because if you're like me, there's no chance you're going to remember why you did something tomorrow. And then another thing on calculations that I'd suggest, particularly on more complicated ones, is maybe add a pop-up expression. So in here, pop-up expressions, I don't know if you guys use these, but I could say, this is the margin at standard. So it's sales minus the standard cost. And that then, when someone hovers on that particular measure, it'll actually tell them that. It'll come up and it'll say, well, you have to add it to the right measure. But nonetheless, there you can see that has a pop-up in it, and it comes up and tells me this is the margin at standard. So my point being, that's a user-level thing where people can come in and they can see information about that. So that's kind of a quick get into some of the basics on what you can do with adding a measure in a very basic function. And I think that's something that hopefully everyone's able to do, but if not, you can do that kind of stuff. And I know a lot of people might want to add those so people can see, in this case, the margin amount. Or if you're exporting to Excel, it can save you a step so that every time you export to Excel, you don't have to add a column and do the calculation in Excel. So you have that ability here in Stratum to do calculations like that. And you have the ability to do much more complex calculations, and we'll start looking at some of those. Let's see here. So I think the next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and add a calculation that, let's say I want to do a percentage of total. And what I want to do here, I call these advanced basic calculations, where I'm going to use some functions, in particular functions that Sylvan provides, to make some of your calculations easier. And let's talk about a couple of different things. So one is, what I'm seeing right now in this view is percentage of change. So I've gone in and do percentage of change. As you guys probably know, you have to take one value minus the other, and then put that, and then divide by that other measure. So that's where you need to do a little bit of math there, and you'd want to protect yourself from a divide by zero. In particular in Stratum, those of you that are exporting to Excel, you will want to not divide by zero, because the return that we get from the database is, some of you guys may have seen it, it's INF, has some other stuff there, but anyways, that said, that does not play well in Excel, so you'll want to have that divide by zero protection built in, and we do that using our Stratum functions. So if I came down and said, let's just continue to work with annual sales here, so this is the annual sales, year-to-date sales, and let's say I wanted to see this as, I don't know, percent of total, so I want to know the percent of total for the annual sales. Pretty easy to do. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to insert a calculated measure. You guys are going to get tired of inserting calculated measures. But I can come down here to my functions. So under functions here, there's a bunch of different functions right now. I'm going to focus on the ones that are specific to Stratum that Sylvan has created and made for you to use. There's also a number of functions here that come that are what we call MDX functions. So these are features of MDX that you can use in the calculations. And these can get quite complex using if statements, Boolean logic, and we're going to look a little bit of that in a minute. But for now, let's say we wanted to get the percentage of total. I just come in here and say percentage of total. Now, some of you may have used some of our functions before, and one thing to note is you don't have to go and like remove where it says numeric expression right there. What that is that tells us that formula is waiting on a single numeric expression to calculate the percent of total. So I'm going to go up, and that numeric expression is always something that comes out of your measures, and I'm going to go find what we want to look at right now is percent of total of the year-to-date number for sales. So I'm going to go up, and here's the this year-to-date number. I'm just going to click on that, and you'll see it automatically inserted that into that particular formula. So it inserted it in a format that fits what is called, as I mentioned earlier, the MDX stuff. And but at that point, I'm pretty much done. I just say OK, and it inserted that. Now, I do need to go back and format this, and again, I'm just, I'll just go in and do the properties, and I'm going to do a format string of percentages. That was a percentage, and I give it a heading, and again, I could add a pop-up expression, but, I'll just say this is percent of total, say OK, and we're ready to go. So I've now inserted percentage of total into my overall display here. So that to me, that's pretty straightforward, easy to do. One other thing that you might want to do, if I look out here, is percentage of change. So this year-to-date percentage of change represents the year over year, this year versus last year. So this column versus this column, and this column, and a percentage of change, which is I described as one minus the other, and then a division. And if you look at that calculation, what that looks like, you can see I just used the # percentage of change, which came from over here, and Stratum Viewer, and I just went down and I said, hey, give me percentage of change. What's cool about that is, by the way, there's a pop-up there that shows you what the calculation does. Of course, is it not only does all the subtraction and the division for me automatically just by popping in those two things, it also does the divide by zero check for me. So that's all cool. That's all built in. So let's say, in addition, I wanted to see the achievement percentage of this year versus last year. So let's go ahead and insert a calculated measure again. And I'm going to use a different function. So Stratum has a number of, I was just talking about the percentage of change, but we also have achievement percentage, or divide with zero check. Under the covers, these are really the same thing, just different names. I'll use achievement percentage, doesn't matter which one you use, but here you'll again see it says numeric expression 1 and then numeric expression 2. Again, you don't have to delete those or clean those up. You can just go over here and say, hey, which measures did you want to use? So I want to take this year's sales. So I'm going to go up and let's see, we have actual sales here, sales amount January through the previous month. This year, I'm going to click on that, and then I want to get actual sales for last year. This is right here, and I'm just going to click on that. And you'll see it automatically inserted that into the calculation. I'm going to say OK. And I also, over here in the properties, I'm going to go ahead and give that a heading. So here we go. Just give that a heading. This is percent achievement. And I'm going to say OK. And then, of course, this is a percentage. So I'm going to pick a percentage format string here. I'll just click that one. I'm going to say OK, and we can see what we got. So here's that percentage. You can see it right here. I'm doing good year over year. But that allows me to go ahead and easily insert a calculated measure using that kind of functionality. So let's see. That's what I call advanced basics. So I'm really using, those are divides, some percentage of change, percentage of total, those kinds of things that are very easily done in Stratum, and you can go ahead and insert those. So now I want to move on to a little more advanced calculations. And in the advanced calculations, there's really one or two key things that people do from a practical standpoint in advanced calculations, and that revolves around, number one, they may use some Boolean logic, and I'll show a little bit of that, and then secondly, they'll use something called a tuple, which there's no reason on earth anyone would just know what a tuple is off the top of their head, at least that I'm aware of. But that is a term that really what that means is you want to see a certain measure, so sales dollars, might be units, could be cost, could be whatever you're looking at, whatever numeric value you're looking at. And I'm trying to make the distinction between a measure and a dimension, which I'm sure those of you that use Stratum a lot are very familiar with. And I want to take a particular measure and limit it by some dimensional value. And that could be, it might be I only want to see sales for a certain product brand. It might want to be I only want to see sales for a certain month or a certain year. And so you can do a lot of things with this. So where would, from a practical standpoint, you want to use a tuple? And I'm going to show another report here. If I come up and show a report for, let's see, I wanted to show a report that uses does not use time ranges. So I'm going to have time going across the top. So I'm going to bring in sales analysis report here. So I find this to be, this is a real simple report again, just company by division. I've got the year and I've got the months going across the page here. So for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about when I say time range view, the interesting thing here is you can see I've got as a dimension, I've got time in here. I've got years and months, and this could be years and weeks or days, whatever you use. In my case, I'm using year-based months. And to make that available, you have to change this property of the measures, so this node right here, which is called measures, and you can go and get to the properties or you can double click, and you have to say time range no, and that opens up the door for you to be able to select to use these year dimensions. Now a couple of things here when I do that. When I'm using based years, in this case, and I drill down, you can see I've drilled down to months based, which just shows me the months going across the page here. But remember, as I'm drilling from year to month, these things are all linked together. So this year, this January is specific to the current year. There would be no data for this particular January because for previous years, because it's constrained to this year. So one of the things I want to do here, let's say what I really want in this display is I want this year and last year's sales, and then I want to calculate a percentage between them. If you were trying to do that, and I just came up here, I'll drill back up to year, so I'm just looking at this year. Here I'm looking at just this year, and let's make this view a little simpler. I'm just going to hide a bunch of stuff real quick here just to make the view simpler. I'm going to go in, I'm going to look just at sales amounts. So let's hide these. I'm going to show you a nice mod where you don't have to go through these individually anymore in our next release. But for right now, so there I've got the sales amount for the current year, and I can drill down and I will see the data for the months because you can see the next thing in my drill down list. By the way, for those of you that don't have 6.8, this is the new navigation panel where your dimensions are up at the top. But so I'm going to go back to the current year and I'm going to say, hey, if I want to see this year versus last year, that's not a problem. I just come in here and say last, right? And now I can see both years. Got this year versus last year. The challenge people have is now they want to create a calculation between these two numbers to see how I did this year versus last year, or when they drill down, they want to see last year versus this year versus last year next to one another, so they can do a calculation between those by month. And here where I drill down, if I drill down, I'm going to get all of last year and the months of last year going across the page, and then I'm going to get current year. And that's because when you're using time as a dimension, just like any other drill down, this January is specific to last year, so it's showing me all the months for last year, and then it's showing me the next value, which is current year, and all the months for that, which goes through September. So how can I get around this? Well, it's pretty easy. I'm going to go back up here, and I'm going to say just change this back to current year. One of the things I'm going to do is, because I know these months are specific to the year I'm looking at, I'm actually going to go ahead and hide those months. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that. Then I'm going to use this months right here. So if you were to look and you can use month, days, weeks, whatever, but I'm going to go ahead and drag that and drop it on here. So it's the next thing in the list. So now when I drill down for a current year, you're not going to see any difference. It says January going across there. The only difference technically is what that heading said right there. But these months are not by themselves constrained by year, but they are because we have a filter on the year here. But there's another way I can apply a filter, and with that, I'm going to insert a tuple calculation. And that was a long lead up to show you what I'm going to do with a tuple calculation. So I'm going to go ahead in here and I'm going to insert a tuple. So you'll find a tuple down here. That's a function. You could just use that, or it's a very simple function. I'm going to put just a parentheses, open paren there. And then I'm going to say, as I mentioned, a tuple is something that filters a certain measure by a dimensional value. So the dimensional value I want here is last year. So we're using year-based months. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to just go to year-based. I'm just working down the list, and I'm going to say pick a member from year-based. I'm going to say, hey, let's do last year. So amazing enough, I just click last year. There it is. It inserted that value for me. You can see here that's from the time dimension and ultimately specifically last year. And then the last thing I want to do is just insert a measure. I want to do that for sales, so I'm going to insert sales. I'm going to do this and say OK. And I'm going to want to add a header. And this is last year's sales. And I'm going to want to go ahead and add a format string that was working in dollars there. So I'm going to go ahead just to match up those things. I'm going to say dollars. Now when I say OK, you'll see now I have a column that's last year's sales. One of the last things I want to do is I don't want to do that calculation at the end. I want to sum that thing so I get a total at the end. So that'll work. Now I have a total for last year. And I can go ahead and, I can drill up. I'll have this year versus last year. And now, if I wanted to create a percentage calculation between those two things, pretty simple. I just say insert a calculate measure item, and I'm going to use a function. We've already seen this. I won't go through all the detail here. I'm going to do achievement percentage, and I'm going to say what measure items, and I'm going to say I want to do this year versus last year. And then I'd say OK. I go ahead and do all my formatting, and you'll see that I now have a percentage inserted right inside there. And an interesting point here, or I think it's interesting, I'm going to go ahead and add the percentage here because I want to show something to try and make this a little more visible. I'm going to go ahead and say, if you look at this percentage, I think I just did them backwards. I did. As you can see, sales amount this year is, no, that's right. Yeah. Never mind. I did that correct. Okay. So anyways, you can see there now I can easily have this year versus last year. And as the months continue, I'll continue to add months here. And this is an interesting thing, right? I can go ahead and I can put months over here so I could have the current year, and I'm looking at, this kind of thing. So I've got that going across the page any way you want to do that. Of course, here I could say, hey, filter this so it's not equal to 0. And that'll get rid of the months that have, the blank months there. So anyways, that's using a tuple with time. And you'll see examples of that in our help. You'll see a lot of that stuff. Now, the other thing I wanted to show was a tuple that where I want to say, let's say my scenario is if I was to look at the data that I have in my particular demo here, I have product brands, which is a roll-up of my products that I use a lot. And I have a private label brand. And let's say what I want to really do is understand my sales I want to understand what percentage private label is of my total sales. So to do that, you can do a couple of different things here. And I'm actually going to go into a development version, so I apologize for if anything goes wrong, and show you some of the new features in 6.9 too. But I'm going to add a new calculation in a view very similar to what we were looking at, and go ahead and add a tuple that allows me to see just the sales for my my private label product brand. So let's see, here's that view we were looking at. You can see actually I was working on making something really similar to the view we were looking at in the other version. I'm going to go ahead and make this a little larger for you guys. Hopefully that makes it a little easier to see. So I'm going to show you a couple features here. So before I show you the tuple, here's an interesting feature, or I think it's interesting. You'll see there's been a little bit of change here, but to add a measure, you can go up here. I'm going to add a calculated measure. Instead of adding a, and let's say what I wanted to do was I want to add this percentage for these last two columns out here. So I just want this this year over year. So I've got here, just so you're aware, rolling 3 months this year versus last year, the current month this year versus last year, and then I've got a rolling 12 this year versus last year. So to do that, normally I could just come in here and use my add a calculated measure, which is this is just another way to get to that. But an interesting way to do this now in version 9 would be to go ahead and add an existing measure, and or edit an existing measure, because one of the features is I'm going to come up and here's that. This is this column right here that is got a conditional format. It's got a bunch of stuff going on there. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. So now you have a copy measure feature. So I'm just going to copy that measure, and you can see it put in. You can see now you can easily get to the caption expression, the format. It has all that. And then again, there's right here you can get to examples for calculated measures, that in context help. It's pretty cool. So it copied that measure. Now the issue for me is that's dividing 3 by 4. You can see here sales. When I say 3 by 4, I mean this data 3 by data 4. Because what's interesting in Stratum world, we really don't care about this text right here. This text is just informational for your purposes to understand what this measure is. So what I really want to do now is divide 2 by 5. I'm down here at the end, and I want to divide this measure number 2 by the measure number 5. I just come in here, change that to 2, and change that to 5, and I'm done. It will now insert that measure for me. It inserted it here. I can drag it down to the bottom where I want it. I'm going to say OK, and now you'll see it's been inserted down here at the end. So I have a replication of what I was doing here by changing those numbers. I'm using these two things, and I'm able to see the percentage. So that said, back to our story. What I wanted to do, what I talked about was I just took product brands here just so I can show them to you. You can see here, here's my private label. It's brand 999. And what I want to do is get the sales just for private label so I can understand what my private label sales are, and then I could compare that to my total sales for the year, for the rolling sale, the total sales for a rolling 12 months, which is this column right here. So I want to see what private label is as a percentage of that ultimately. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a calculated measure. So to insert a calculated measure like this, a couple of things. When you're going to do a tuple like this, one of the things that you'll probably want to do is make sure you're doing this only when there is data. So we know that I want to insert this looking at the rolling 12-month sales. So I'm going to say if, and when you do an if, you'll notice IIF, but I'm going to say if this measure, I'm going to pick one of my measures, and that's my rolling 12 months. I'm just going to say if that's equal to 0, I'm just going to say null. Then, in that case, Stratum won't go through and do the calculation, and this will help you from a performance standpoint. Now let's get to the tuple. This is the really important part. I want to get the brand 999 here, so I'm going to just go ahead and say, again, I'm going to go to my hierarchies. I'm going to say there's my product brand. Break that down. I'm going to members, and I'm just going to say pick 999. So I'm going to say OK, and then I'm going to say comma. And just like we did before, I'm going to go ahead and select my measure item. It's my last measure item here, the actual sales. This is the rolling 12 that I want. Now I'm going to say put a parentheses there to close that, and then I'll need to close the parentheses that I added up here. So I just added a paren for that. So while I'm in 6.9, it's kind of cool. Now I can just do the caption right here. I'm just going to say this is private label sales, right? So I'm adding that, and I'm going to say OK, and then I also can give a format string right here. So this is actually a dollar figure again. So I'm just going to pick a dollar figure, say OK. And now we've inserted the private label sales, and of course I can drag this around, put it wherever I want. But now I've got just the private label sales there, and I don't have to go through now, I don't think, creating a percentage calculation of this over that. But now I'm seeing just the private label sales. Let's take that example one step further and say what I really wanted to see was private label plus a couple other brands or another brand as a percentage of what I'm doing here. So I'm going to take, I'm going to go ahead and add another column here. I'll just add you know what I'll do? I'll do this, and I'm going to copy private label sales here. So I'm going to copy that. So I'm kind of starting with what we had before. But what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to delete the tuple here and show you how you could do multiple brands. So here I want to get a total that's multiple brands so I can see those. And I can go ahead here and I'm going to go back up to hierarchies just like I did before. I'm going to go to brands. I'm going to work my way down to members. I'm going to select from the member list, and we want to get our private label, and let's say we want Southern Sweet. So the sum of those two things is what I care about. And I think this kind of calculation has a lot of merit in a number of cases where you've got dimensional values going down the side, but you want to add some dimensions across the top to see total sales for something. So you can do this. So again, I'm going to add those two things. So I'm going to say I want those two things. And you'll see it brought that back for me here. It's a little different than what we brought back before. It has the squiggly brackets on it, which is because there's multiple things listed here. But this is pretty simple. And so if we just remember our tuple concept, where what I want is dimensional values that are ultimately going to be what I see in my measure. So here I'm going to say, what do I want? I want sales again. I want that rolling 12 months that was at the end here. So it's that same data 5. I'm going to go ahead and select it. Need to put a parentheses around it. I'm going to put a parentheses up here, and the other thing I'm going to talk about here is sum. So if you have multiple members listed in here, where I have, you can see I have brand number 6, and I have brand 999. In that case, I want to sum those, so I have to use the word sum. And I put parentheses around the whole thing, and then I just need one more parentheses to close it for the if statement up here. And when I say, oh, and I need to give this this was private, what was this, private and suite, something like that, I think it was. Private and suite sales. I'm going to say okay, and this format will be fine. So I'm going to say okay, and now we say, and now you'll see I've got a different number down here. So that's the sum of those two things. So I find that to be a really practical use of more complex calculations that allow you to go ahead and add multiple values together for something. So those were some examples that I wanted to show and talk through. Obviously, this was recorded. I'm pretty suspicious everyone won't remember everything I did there, but hopefully that was some good information for you to be able to see that. Now, I wanted to talk about a couple other things here because I think it's pertinent. There are a number of examples of calculations. I already mentioned the help, and I think there's good examples in there. There's also some things where I typically myself or someone else here at Stratum, at Sylvan, were asked questions. And I've gone to the forum here. You can find this off of CustomerNet or off stratum.com, sylvan.com. But this, or off the home page. I think if I go over here, I can, if I go to the home page, we'll be able to see it, right? There's some entries here. You can see there's been some recent stuff going on. But but this forum, you can just click here and it'll take you to the forum as well. So this header, it'll take you to the forum. But when I'm in this forum, there's some interesting stuff here, and there's a couple of interesting calculations that were real life situations that we helped customers with. One was, I'm going to search here on Monday because I just happen to know that'll get me the, but so the basic scenario here was a customer has a flash report that shows them yesterday's sales, and but what they want to do on Friday, on Monday, is they want to see Friday's sales. That's their last full selling day, so they want to see the sales for Friday. Versus on Tuesday, they want to see it just from a day ago. So how can you create a calculation that'll help you with that? And you can do that in Stratum. And this is, again, I won't go through all the detail here, but you can see here's all the detail, and ultimately it uses this date part function, which actually returns a number. 1 is equal to Sunday, 2, et cetera. So you can tell based off the current date what day of the week it is. And then in your measures, you can then just set up an if statement like this that says, hey, if there's sales where, here we go, if it's Monday, so I'm going to say if date part is equal to 2, which is Monday, show the sales from 3 days ago. Otherwise, show the sales from 1 day ago. And, that's a pretty great example of how you can use data both from inside Stratum and outside Stratum, where we're reaching out and using data from your system, to be able to calculate that. So anyways, and there's descriptions of this stuff out there. Hopefully that's useful. And I thought another one that was pretty good was actually something we recently answered for someone where they wanted to see it, what they call an outlook. And an outlook is the idea that I've got a forecast for the year, but when I'm looking at sales for each month, as I move through the year and I close my months, I want to substitute in the actual sales. For those months that haven't occurred yet, I want to place the forecast in there so I have a year-to-date total that represents what I'm expecting to do versus which takes into account what I've already done. And this goes in and you can see, again, there's quite a bit I won't go through the whole calculation. You can find all this in the forum, but ultimately that led me to a view that is actually querying the name of the month and going ahead and saying, hey, if it's a past month, substitute in the sales, this line that's highlighted right here. The months up through September are getting the actual sales. The months past that are actually getting the forecast. And further than that, with calculated measures, we're able to do some more logic there and say, hey, for those future months, if we've got more orders already booked than the forecast, use the order number, the open orders, instead of the forecast. So you can, I'm chaining these calculations together to go ahead and make the view much more relevant to what I think from a business perspective we really want to see there. So I'm seeing what actually happened in the prior months. I'm seeing orders. If we're ahead of forecast on orders, I'm seeing the orders. If not, I'm using the forecast to predict what we're going to do for the remainder of the year, and then I get a total nut for the year. So those, I think, are some good examples of just another resource. There's a lot of the things that end up in the forum are based around calculations. So there's some good stuff. If you're not monitoring the forum, go ahead and sign up for that. You get pinged, I don't know, once a day or something that something was added. Or it does show up here in your homepage, and these little new buttons show up when anything new is added. So that might be interesting to you as well. And that's not a bad place to post questions, et cetera. Now, one last thing I want to talk about in calculations that I talked about at the beginning of our show today. It was that calculations, we think of those as calculating numbers, as I was showing there, whether it's percentage of total, change percentage, whether it's the total sales for a product brand, those kinds of things. But in Stratum, the other thing that you get is you can use what is the MDX language, which is the basis for a lot of the calculations, to do filtering as well. And I wanted to just show a couple quick, simple examples of that. And I'm going to go right back to that comparative sales, simple thing here. But let's say, again, let me go to my product brands, and I'm just going to drag my product brands down here, right, and just drop those in. Let's say I want to see all of the sales except private label. Now, so this is exclusion filtering, which if I go up here and do a normal filter, we know that when I go into product brand, I could select all the brands except private label, and then I get that total. The problem with that, of course, is if you add a new brand, you have to remember to go back and select it. So to do exclusion filtering, I'm going to go ahead, and if we say we want to see everything except private label, I'm going to go ahead and filter, but I'm going to go here, and I'm going to change the filter type, and I'm actually going to change that to an expression. I'm going to go ahead and put together an expression very similar to what we were doing before, but in this case, since it's a filter, I don't have to have the if. I'm just going to say for product brand, I'm going to go ahead and select product brand, and I'm going to say, I'm going to use some other MDX here. I'm going to say if it's the current member. So when I say the current member, that means for the product brand, whatever the current member that I'm looking at, if it is I want that not equal to the current member name. I'm sorry, name. I want to say, so that's the current member. So when we're looking at brands, I want to say what's the name, and I want to say that's not equal to, quote, 999, right? So 999, again, was my private label. I'm going to say OK, and I say OK, and now you'll see that I keyed in the expression wrong. So let's go up here and do that again. So comparative sales. And I'm just going to go ahead and bring my brands down again. And I'll add the filter. Go through that again for you. Product brand, and I'm going to say, whoops, said the wrong thing there. I'm going to say change the filter type to an expression, And I'm going to say, yep, let's see here, product brand, dot, current member, not equal to, quote, 999. Is that what I want? Let's see, validate that. Okay. So I say okay. And what have I done wrong here? Let's see here. Oh, right. I didn't add the name in there. So I'm going to go back up here, and I'm just going to click on this. This takes me straight to what I was doing. I need the current member dot name. So the current member dot name, say OK, and now you'll see that removed private label, there. So now I'm looking at product brand sales minus that particular amount. So you know, I think it's an interesting way for you to go ahead and filter and say, hey, I want to see everything except something in the list there. So there you can see that you can do that. And you could do that with an or. I could continue to add things in there. You know, you can use or expressions here. So again, these are just calculations. And again, there's some great help on this to show you how to do some of these things in the help. But I can add ands and ors in here to do that kind of thing. So that's one example of a filter where it's more of a calculation. The other that I wanted to show was if I brought if I drop products over here, for example, so I'm just going to drop products in here for right now, I could go ahead and say, you know, I only want to see products that had more than, let's see here, let's say I want to see stuff that only had more than, there's some here. So let's say in the current year, I want anything for the previous month that had more than 100 grand in sales, or there was more than $1 million in sales year to date. So those are the only two things I want to see. So to do that, I can just come in here and I can go ahead and add an access filter just by going to the access, and I can say on the rows, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to select the measure, and I'm going to say, hey, sales for the current month, which is that measure there. I'm going to say greater than 100,000, or I'm going to say year-to-date measures, I'm going to say that's greater than $1 million. So again, very similar to calculations, and now it's filtered out all that stuff, and you can see that there. So, and I've got a filter up here on the rows that tells me that. So where do those kind of filters come in handy? When you're starting to build views that are maybe used for alerts and you want to build in complex business rules to really limit what's in your display so that you get a notification of just the exceptions to whatever the business rules are, this is a great way to have a bunch of different calculations or cumulative calculations that you want to see what's going on there. So there you go. That's today's session. I'm going to actually take the phones off mute if anyone's got a question. I think I did. And
unmuted.
There we go. I've now unmuted the participants. If anyone has a question, feel free to ask. Otherwise, we'll call it a day.